Hi, I'm Tom Burke, the Associate Dean of Public Health Practice at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and welcome to Public Health on the Inside, your inside look into the world of public health. Have you ever been bullied? As a former high school teacher, a parent, and a little kid who used to have to carry my accordion to lessons every Wednesday at school, I can tell you I've had some heartfelt experience with the devastating effects of bullying, and it's probably something that has touched every family. And today I'm happy to introduce our guest, Dr. Catherine Bradshaw, a developmental psychologist and associate professor here at the Bloomberg School in our Department of Mental Health. Catherine is a mental health services and prevention researcher who focuses on examining the development of aggressive and problem behaviors among children and how we might initiate school-based prevention. Her research ranges from assessing bullying and the school climate to the implementation of evidence-based prevention programs in the schools, bringing the evidence to make policies stronger. She also works with the Maryland State Department of Education and several school districts, and she is a national expert on this challenge of how we might understand the factors that contribute to school violence and bullying and bad behaviors. And she's also a leading scientist in bringing the evidence through public health science to trying to prevent these kinds of devastating effects. So, Catherine, welcome to Public Health on the Inside.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today and for covering this important topic.
Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about the epidemiology of the problem. As I mentioned, we've probably all been touched by it in some way, but how big a problem is bad behavior, aggressive behavior, and bullying in our schools?
Well, bullying behavior is a particular form of aggressive behavior that's generally intentional in nature. It typically occurs repeated over time and in instances where there's a power or status difference between individuals. So it's a very particular form of aggressive or problem behavior. More generally, our research here in the Bloomberg School of Public Health addresses a wide range of challenging behaviors that youth can engage in, and bullying is one of those that can also be a risk factor for other mental health concerns, behavioral concerns like substance use, as well as potentially devastating mental health concerns like depression and anxiety. In terms of what are some risk factors for it, we know that exposure to violence in the home could be a risk factor. Rejection by peers can lead some youth to develop aggressive ways of interacting with their peers to try to really, in some ways, bond and connect with other youth. We also know that bullying is relatively prevalent. We have several studies, both nationally and internationally, that show up to 30% of youth are involved in bullying on a frequent basis. And that means 2 or more times in a week that they are exposed and directly involved in bullying.
What ages are most affected, and is it a problem mostly with boys, or are girls also impacted by this?
From a developmental perspective, we start to see some rates of early aggressive behavior problems develop through elementary school, and that they might increase by grades 4 or 5. And generally, bullying tends to be greatest during those middle school years, so grades 6 through 8. And then it starts to tip down just a little bit in high school, although there are some changes that occur with regard to the form. So, for example, younger children tend to be involved in bullying that's more physical in nature, but as they get into adolescence, it might take more social or indirect forms, like spreading rumors or gossip about each other, or using electronic devices, what we refer to as cyberbullying.
Well, I want to ask you about that because in the last few years, I think we've all been made aware of the role of social media and maybe a new form of bullying that can be devastating, even leading to suicides in the victims. And is it changing? Is it becoming something that affects all ages?
Well, cyberbullying, as it's referred to generally in the media, we researchers often refer to it as electronic forms of aggression, is a relatively newer development. When I was a kid growing up, we would, do prank calls and things. But nowadays, kids have cell phones and smartphones and internet access 24/7, and so they can really use the internet and other social media as a vehicle for harm as well as for connecting positively with other youth. While cyberbullying has gotten a lot of attention in the media, one thing that's often overlooked is the fact that it's actually the least common form of bullying that youth engage in. The much more common forms are things like the social forms, the what we refer to as relational. So social exclusion, spreading rumors, talking badly, and verbal forms of bullying. So for example, in some large-scale data collection that we've been doing here in Maryland on over 25,000 students, we find that within a typical month, about 30% of youth across all ages, pulling from grades 3 through grade 12, that we see about 30% are involved in bullying, including forms such as relational and social forms, but under 10% are involved in the cyberbullying. So with that caveat in mind, there is some research to indicate that cyberbullying can actually be more harmful, even though it's less prevalent than some of the other forms.
I've heard references to that here in our school among graduate students who, please don't put these pictures on Facebook or things during a student event or something like that. People are very afraid of the broad reach of the social media.
And rightly so, because youth often don't really understand the impact of their behaviors, that they might take a photo that they would share in an intimate relationship with a friend, not expecting that to be used outside of that context. But the relationships, especially during adolescence, can often be a little bit tenuous. Take, for example, a romantic relationship where youth might share a photo of themselves nude or partially nude within the context of that relationship. Certainly that's not something we would condone regardless of the relationship, but you can very easily imagine a situation where that gets in the hands of other people and can be very rapidly sent across a large network, either in the case of bullying or just in the case of a joke that very well could lead to rapid transmission of that very sensitive and somewhat sexual information.
Catherine, bullying has had devastating effects, and I think most of us are aware that it's had effects even as drastic as suicide in young people. Tell me about the effects of bullying and how big a problem this is.
Well, there's been a lot of national attention to the issue of bullying in the media, much of which has stemmed from some high-profile cases of suicide that may be either directly or indirectly related to bullying events. And while this is certainly a teachable moment for us to pause and understand the potential impact of bullying on mental health concerns, I think there's often been a quick jump to the conclusion that bullying causes suicide, and that is not necessarily the case. What's really important is that we draw out the link between suicidal ideation and underlying mental health concerns, which could be the result of a bullying incident or just could be a subsequent risk factor. So generally, we want to draw people's attention to the importance of underlying mental health vulnerabilities that might relate to suicide, and that those are really the primary focus. There might be some instances where youth that are particularly vulnerable from a mental health perspective that also experience bullying, and that might serve as an additional risk factor.
So other factors like being depressed, perhaps being anxious or being a little bit outside or perhaps quiet might be a risk factor for these kinds of behaviors as well.
Right, and those also can be risk factors for being a target of bullying, so we can naturally see how some might draw that conclusion there that one causes the other. But suicide is a very complex phenomenon and also includes not only these individual mental health factors, but sometimes family factors and access to lethal means of self-harm.
And it seems to be such a problem at such a delicate developmental stage of life.
Exactly.
When people are establishing their identities.
And we also know that adolescents and young adults are at greater risk for suicide than at other age levels because of things like impulsivity and not really realizing the long-term consequences of a particular action, and just general emotional ups and downs that adolescents might experience and thus are particularly sensitive to problems they might be having in the peer group.
Now, film and entertainment and even, frankly, old-fashioned family values have led to kind of an acceptance of a certain amount of bullying. Even it's been romanticized in film as kind of put up your dukes and stand up for yourself. And the triumph of the nerd over the bully is a common entertainment theme. What role does a family play in prevention and awareness of aggressive behavior and bullying?
The family plays a critical role in all aspects of development, including aggressive behavior, modeling violence in the home, or talking to your children about how you resolve interpersonal conflict. There's a study that we engaged in here in the Johns Hopkins in collaboration with the School of Medicine, Dr. Tina Chang's work, where she was seeing a lot of youth coming into the emergency department with assault injuries, and the youth were saying, "Let me back out there, let me go get that kid." And so we collaborated on some studies looking at the retaliatory issues related to violence and the role that parents might play. And so one particular study that Dr. Chang led and included some of our other colleagues here in the School of Public Health, such as Sarah Lindstrom Johnson, had parents and youth watch videos about conflict, including things such as bullying. And the parents and child talked about it, saying how would they actually respond in these situations. In 92% of those cases, the parents endorsed an aggressive response. And so the youth are coming away from those conversations, sometimes with mixed messages, thinking, my parent wants me to hit back, but then generally they don't want me to get into fights. And so it's not surprising that some youth are confused about how to really respond. As a parent myself, I certainly want to do anything I can to support my family and my child's development. And when my child is hurt by others or pushed around by others, there is a little bit of a natural inclination to say, oh, get back in there. But we generally don't encourage retaliation or physical forms of violence in response to bullying, because we know from research that does significantly increase the likelihood of the youth getting injured and also the violence continuing. So it generally doesn't stop that cycle of violence.
So I vividly remember having a girl in class when I was teaching high school who stopped coming to school because she was afraid of someone in the class and just lost her education as a result of that. We intervened, but I always was afraid it was too late. What advice do you have for parents and teachers when they might be struggling with this with a person that they care about?
Well, I think that's an excellent example of why we in the field of education and public health care so much about this issue of bullying, because it's not just a fact of life that happens for kids. It can significantly impact their academic as well as their mental health functioning. It can cause them to disengage from the academic environment, and thus that translates into poor academic performance and thus gets on the national radar around these issues. When it comes to intervention, we generally recommend that teachers get training on how to spot incidents of bullying, as you were in that case, how to intervene effectively. This sadly is an area where there hasn't been as much significant impact of our intervention programming, that we are still trying to identify different strategies that adults can use to intervene effectively in these situations.
Well, the good news about your work is that it's really having an impact and it's making change in the schools. Tell us a little bit about the successes from our new knowledge, our evidence about prevention.
Well, we are very fortunate to work in close partnership with the Maryland State Department of Education, who's always had a very strong commitment to creating safe and supportive learning environments for students. We also work with Shepherd Pratt Health System, another local mental health provider here in the state of Maryland. So we've had a very extensive partnership with them lasting over a decade to try to address issues like bullying in the schools here within the state of Maryland. We also collaborate with each of the 24 local school districts to try to develop and test and scale up evidence-based models. So my colleague Phil Leaf and I and Nicholas Ialongo and I have been working in collaboration for several years with school districts around the states to identify evidence-based models and help provide supports that they're implemented with fidelity, and then help to actually scale up the effective models.
Catherine, I think that's great. This is a problem that touches so many people. Maybe a lot of our listeners don't think of it as a traditional public health problem, but your work shows the broad reach of public health, how our science can be put to use and applied to problems and make a huge difference. Thank you for being here today, and thank all of you for listening to Public Health on the Inside.